The Galactic Empire declared war on humanity in the grandest ceremony I had ever witnessed. With all the menace and majesty 10,000 years of imperial power could summon. And humanity's envoy listened to the whole terrible declaration. And then he laughed softly and reached into his coat and took out a newspaper and began to read it. And I, who stood at attention in that great hall as an officer of the empire, sworn to its power and certain of its glory, watched a single unarmed human deflate the mightiest war machine in the galaxy with nothing but a laugh and a folded sheet of paper. And I did not understand that day that I was watching the most important thing I would ever see. I thought I was watching an insult. I thought I was watching a fool who did not understand the doom that had just been pronounced over his species. I was wrong about all of it. The human understood the doom perfectly. He simply understood something else better, something about war and about us, and about what a declaration of war actually is. And what he did with that newspaper changed not only the war but me, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what he showed me in that hall. Let me tell you about the Empire first, and about who I was inside it, because you cannot understand the laugh until you understand the thing it was laughing at. I was an officer, call me Sub-Marshal Korth, a rank that meant something then, in the empire of my youth. I had been born into the imperial service, raised in it, shaped by it, and I believed in it with the total, uncomplicated faith of someone who has never been given a reason to doubt. The Galactic Empire was the great fact of our galaxy. It was old beyond reckoning, vast beyond imagining, powerful beyond any rival, a civilization that had spent 10,000 years conquering, absorbing, and ruling, until a great swath of the galaxy answered to the imperial throne and trembled at the imperial name. We were proud. We had every reason to be proud, or so I believed. We were the order that held the galaxy together, the strength that kept the peace, the power before which lesser peoples bowed. And war was our great instrument, the thing we did better than anyone, the thing our whole civilization was built to do. When the Empire declared war on a people, that people did one of two things: it submitted or it was destroyed. There was no third outcome. There had never in 10,000 years been a third outcome. The declaration of war by the Galactic Empire was, in effect, a death sentence with one available appeal, which was surrender, and most peoples, faced with it, surrendered because they were not fools. I had been raised to believe all of this was good. That is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who did not grow up inside an empire. That the cruelty did not feel like cruelty from the inside, that it felt like order, like strength, like the natural and rightful arrangement of the universe. From my earliest years, I was taught that the empire was the thing that kept the galaxy from chaos, that the lesser peoples were fortunate to be ruled, that the dooms we pronounced upon the defiant were regrettable necessities, the firm hand a parent uses on an unruly child. I did not question it because there was nothing in my world to question it with. Every voice I had ever heard, every teacher, every officer, every text told the same story. The empire was great, the empire was right, the empire's strength was the only thing standing between the galaxy and ruin, and to serve the empire was the highest thing a being could do. I believed it completely. I was not a cruel person, you understand. I want you to know that, not to excuse myself, but because it is important to the story. I was not a monster. I was a decent enough being who had been raised inside a monstrous arrangement and taught to see it as decent, and that, I have come to understand, is how most of the cruelty in any galaxy actually gets done, not by monsters, but by decent beings who have been taught that the monstrous thing is good, and who never get the one thing that might wake them up, which is a moment that makes them see, suddenly and undeniably, the people on the other end of the order they serve. I had never had that moment. I had served the empire for years, had stood at attention through dooms and conquests, and had never once been made to see the doomed as anything but the doomed. The human with his newspaper was about to give me that moment, in the Hall of Declarations, in front of the whole empire, and it would unmake everything I had been raised to be. Humanity, the Empire had decided, would be made to surrender or be destroyed like all the rest. The humans were newer than most of the peoples we had absorbed, and they had been spreading through their corner of the galaxy with a vigor that the Imperial Court found first amusing and then, as it continued, irritating and finally, by the logic that governs all empires, threatening. They did not bow. That was the heart of it, I think, looking back. The humans did not bow. They were not hostile, exactly, not aggressive toward the Empire, but they conducted themselves with a kind of casual self-possession, an assumption of their own equal worth, that the Empire found intolerable in a young and minor species. We were accustomed to being feared. The humans were not afraid of us, or did not seem to be, and a people who is not afraid of the Empire is a problem the Empire knows only one way to solve. And so the decision was made in the high councils of the Imperial throne to bring humanity to heel, to declare war, formally, with all the terrible ceremony of imperial doom, and to give the humans the choice every people was given: kneel or be broken. I was present in a junior capacity for some of the discussions that led to that decision, and I will tell you honestly that even then, even believing everything I believed, something about it sat strangely with me, a small unease I did not examine and could not have named, because the case against humanity was thin. I noticed it without letting myself notice it, the way you do when a thing troubles you but troubling you is not permitted. The great offenses humanity was supposed to have committed, when you actually looked at them, were not offenses at all in any ordinary sense. They were, mostly, instances of the humans simply failing to show the proper deference, conducting their affairs as though they were anyone's equal, declining to grovel where groveling was expected. The Imperial Court spoke of these things in the grave language of provocation and insult, building them up, one small slight atop another, into a towering edifice of grievance that justified the doom, and I remember a part of me, a small quiet part I quickly silenced, thinking, but they have not actually done anything. They have only failed to be afraid of us, and we are going to destroy a world for it. I silenced that thought, of course. I was good at silencing such thoughts. We all were. An empire runs on the silencing of such thoughts. But it was there, and it tells you something true about the war that even an officer raised to believe, present at its making, felt the wrongness of it flicker through him before pride and training smoothed it away. The war against humanity was built on nothing, and somewhere underneath my loyalty I half knew it, and I think I have come to believe that half of the Imperial Court half knew it too, and that this is part of why the Humans newspaper worked the way it did. He was not telling us something wholly foreign. He was telling us out loud, a thing many of us had already half known and refused to look at, that the Emperor had no quarrel, that the doom was built on air. I want you to understand what an imperial declaration of war actually was, as a thing, as a ceremony, because the grandeur of it is essential to the story. It was not a memo. It was not a quiet diplomatic notice. It was a spectacle, deliberately, designed across 10,000 years to do a specific thing, which was to break the will of the receiving people before a single shot was fired. The Empire would summon the envoy of the doomed people to the great hall of declarations at the heart of the imperial capital, a chamber built to overwhelm, vast and dark and towering, every line of it engineered to make a visitor feel small and powerless and afraid. The imperial dignitaries would assemble in their thousands, ranked in their terrible splendor. The instruments of imperial might would be displayed. And then, with full ceremony in the ancient formal language of imperial war, the declaration would be pronounced, a long, sonorous, magnificent recitation of the empire's power and the doomed people's offenses and the terrible fate now descending upon them. And the envoy of the doomed people would be made to stand there and receive it, alone, small, surrounded by the overwhelming majesty of the power about to destroy their world. It worked. I had seen it work, more than once. I had seen envoys of proud peoples reduced to trembling, had seen them break down, had seen them fall to their knees and beg for the mercy of surrender before the declaration was even finished. That was the point. That was the weapon. The declaration was designed to make resistance feel not just futile but unthinkable, to crush the spirit before the war ever touched the body. And it had never, in 10,000 years, failed to produce its effect. I had watched it break a being once years before, and the memory had stayed with me, and it is worth telling you because it is the measure against which the human's calm has to be understood. The envoy that time had come from a proud old people, a warrior culture, and he had walked into the hall of declarations with his head high and fire in his eyes, determined, you could see it, to receive the doom with defiance, to show the empire that his people would not be cowed. And the hall went to work on him. That is the only way I can describe it, the chamber, the scale, the darkness, the thousands of cold eyes, the slow crushing weight of the ceremony. It went to work on him methodically the way it was built to, and I watched his defiance crumble in real time. I watched the fire go out of his eyes. I watched his proud posture sag. I watched the terrible understanding settle over him, that he was alone and small and powerless before a thing too vast to fight. And by the time the high declarant pronounced the final word, the proud warrior envoy was on his knees, weeping, begging for the terms of surrender, his defiance entirely gone, broken not by any weapon but by the sheer overwhelming theater of imperial doom. I had felt, watching it, the grim satisfaction we were all trained to feel, the confirmation of imperial power, the rightness of the order, the lesser people learning its place. I did not let myself feel the pity. There was pity in me, I think, buried with all the other thoughts I was not permitted, but I did not let myself feel it. That was what the declaration did. That was what it had always done. It took proud, brave, defiant beings and broke them, reliably, completely, and made them kneel. So when I tell you that the human stood in that same spot, in that same chamber, under that same crushing weight, and did not break, when I tell you that he stood where the proud warrior had wept and begged, and instead looked mildly amused and took out a newspaper, I need you to feel how impossible that was, how completely outside anything the hall had ever produced, how the thing that protected him was not armor or strength, but something the chamber had no leverage on at all. And then humanity sent its envoy, and the envoy was a problem from the moment he walked in. He was an ordinary-looking human. That was the first thing that struck me, standing at my post in the great hall, that the envoy of this troublesome species was so utterly unremarkable. He was not young, not old, neither imposing nor frail, dressed in a plain dark suit of human design with no ornament, no insignia of rank, nothing to mark him as the representative of a world about to be condemned. He walked into the hall of declarations, that vast dark chamber engineered to terrify, filled with thousands of ranked imperial dignitaries in their splendor, designed across 10,000 years to make a visitor feel like an insect before a god. And he looked around at all of it slowly, taking it in. And I watched his face for the fear that always came, the awe, the dawning terror, the beginning of the break. And it did not come. He looked at the towering dark architecture and the thousands of terrible dignitaries and the displayed instruments of imperial might. And his expression, as near as I could read a human's, was not awe. It was something closer to mild, friendly interest, as though he had walked into an impressive building and was politely admiring the decor. He even, I think, almost smiled, a small private something at the corner of his mouth, quickly composed, and I remember a flicker of unease going through me, the first hairline crack in my certainty, because in all the declarations I had witnessed, I had never seen an envoy walk in looking faintly, pleasantly amused. There were other things about him, small things that I noticed without understanding, that I have turned over many times since. He was carrying something under his arm when he came in. I could not see what then. I know now it was the newspaper, held casually, the way you carry a thing you mean to read, not the way an envoy carries the documents of a doomed people. He moved without hurry and without the stiffness of fear, and he looked at the imperial dignitaries not the way the doomed look at their judges, with dread, but the way a traveler looks at the people of a place he is visiting, with a kind of open curiosity, taking us in, finding us interesting. At one point, crossing the vast floor toward the appointed spot, he actually paused to look up at some feature of the great dark architecture, some soaring terrible span of the ceiling built to make visitors feel crushed, and he tilted his head and regarded it with what I can only call appreciation, the way you might admire an impressive piece of engineering, and then he nodded slightly, to himself, as if to say well made, and continued on. I had never seen anything like it. The chamber was screaming its menace at him with every line and shadow, and he was admiring the craftsmanship. And there was a moment, just a moment, when his eyes passed across the ranked officers and happened to meet mine, and he did a thing no doomed envoy had ever done in my presence. He gave me a small, friendly nod, an ordinary human acknowledgement of another person, one being to another, as though we were not an officer of the Empire about to destroy his world and the envoy of the world about to be destroyed, but just two people who happened to be in the same room. It unsettled me more than any defiance could have. Defiance I understood. Defiance was part of the script. This ordinary human friendliness, this complete refusal to play the role of the doomed, this treating of the whole terrible ceremony as though it were a slightly overwrought social occasion. I had no framework for it at all, and it crept under my certainty like a draft under a door. He took his place at the appointed spot, the small bare place at the center of the vast hall where the doomed envoy stood to receive the doom, the place engineered to be the loneliest spot in the galaxy. And he stood there calmly, his hands folded, and he waited with the easy patience of a man waiting for a bus, while the great machinery of the Imperial Declaration assembled itself around him. I was close enough to see him well. I kept watching for the fear. The chamber was doing everything it had been built to do: the darkness, the scale, the thousands of cold Imperial eyes, the crushing sense of overwhelming power gathered to destroy you. And the human stood in the middle of it, unremarkable and calm and faintly amused, and did not break, did not tremble, did not show the first sign of the terror the room was engineered to produce. I told myself he was in shock. I told myself the fear would come when the declaration began, when the formal doom was actually pronounced, when the words made it real. I was wrong. The fear never came because the human was not afraid, because the human knew something the entire Imperial Court did not, and was waiting with that patient private amusement for the right moment to share it. The declaration began. The High Declarant rose, an imposing figure, a master of the terrible ceremony, and in the ancient formal language of Imperial war, in a voice built to fill that vast dark hall and crush the soul of whoever stood at its center, he began to pronounce the doom of humanity. It was magnificent. I will not pretend it was not. 10,000 years of imperial majesty went into that recitation, the rolling sonorous declaration of the Empire's limitless power, the cataloging of humanity's offenses against the imperial order, the formal pronouncement that the Galactic Empire did now declare total war upon the human species, and that humanity's only path to survival lay in immediate and unconditional surrender to the imperial throne. The words rolled through the great hall like thunder. The thousands of dignitaries listened in terrible silence. Every eye turned to the small, unremarkable human at the center of it all, waiting for him to break, as every envoy before him had broken, beneath the weight of the doom descending upon his world. And the human listened to the whole thing, politely, attentively, even his head slightly tilted, like a man listening to a long speech at a function he is too well-mannered to seem bored by. He waited until the High Declarant had pronounced the final terrible word, until the declaration of total war hung complete in the air of that vast hall, until the silence that followed was absolute, and every eye was fixed on him, and the whole empire waited for the doomed envoy to fall to his knees. And then into that silence the human laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly. He laughed the way you laugh when someone tells you something so disproportionate, so wildly out of scale with reality, that the laugh comes out before you can stop it, a warm, surprised, almost affectionate laugh. The laugh of a man who has just watched a great deal of effort go into a tremendous misunderstanding. And then, while 10,000 years of imperial majesty hung in the air waiting to crush him, the human reached calmly into his plain dark coat and took out a folded newspaper and shook it open and began, unhurriedly, to read. That's where I have to stop this first time. Because what the human did with that newspaper, what he read and why, and how a single unarmed envoy with a folded sheet of paper unmade the most terrible war machine in the galaxy, not with power but with something the Empire had no defense against at all. And what it did to me, an officer of the Empire sworn to its glory, to watch the doom of humanity dissolve into a laugh and a newspaper. That's the whole of the story, and I need you standing exactly here first. In the great dark hall of declarations at the heart of the Galactic Empire, 10,000 years of imperial majesty assembled to crush one small species, the doom of humanity pronounced and hanging in the air, and the human envoy, who should have been on his knees, calmly opening a newspaper to read. With a small private smile, as though the most powerful empire in the galaxy had just told him a mildly amusing joke. For a moment no one in the great hall knew what to do. I certainly did not. None of us did. In 10,000 years of imperial declarations, in all the long, terrible history of that chamber, there was no protocol for this, no procedure, no precedent, because the thing the human was doing was not in any category we possessed. He was not surrendering. He was not defying. He was not even ignoring us exactly. He was reading a newspaper. He stood at the center of the Hall of Declarations, at the loneliest spot in the galaxy, with the doom of his species hanging complete in the air, and he had opened a folded sheet of human paper and was reading it with every appearance of mild, pleasant absorption, as a man might read in a waiting room, and the entire assembled majesty of the Galactic Empire simply did not know how to respond to it. The high declarant stood frozen mid-pose. The thousands of dignitaries exchanged glances. The whole crushing apparatus of the declaration, the weapon built to break the spirit, hung useless in the air, because it had been designed to overwhelm fear, defiance, despair, every response a doomed people might have, and it had no answer at all for a man who simply declined to be doomed. And then the human looked up from his newspaper pleasantly, as though he had just remembered we were there, and he spoke. And his voice, in that vast hall built to swallow voices, was calm and ordinary and somehow carried perfectly, because it was the only unterrified sound in the room. "I'm sorry," he said. "Please, don't let me interrupt. It's just I have to be honest with you. I've been listening to all of this, the whole declaration, and I've been trying to take it seriously. I really have, but I'm afraid I can't, and I think the kindest thing I can do is tell you why instead of pretending." He folded the newspaper but kept it in his hand. "You've declared war on us," he said, "and you've done it very impressively, and I want you to know I appreciate the effort that went into the ceremony. It's genuinely magnificent. But I don't think you understand what you've actually done, and before anyone dies over it, I'd like to explain. Because you haven't declared war on an enemy. You've declared war on a misunderstanding, and I brought the newspaper to show you." I did not understand him. No one did. But there was something in the calm friendliness of it, the complete absence of either fear or threat that held the room, and the high declarant who should have called the guards, who should have ended this insolence, instead found himself. I saw it, simply listening, the way we were all simply listening, caught off guard by a thing none of us had any defense against. I looked around the hall, in that strange held moment, and what I saw on the faces of the imperial dignitaries told me that something was happening that went deeper than the insolence of one envoy. By every rule of that chamber, the proper response to what the human was doing was outrage. The dignitaries should have been on their feet, demanding his removal, his punishment, his immediate doom for the insult to imperial majesty. And they were not. They were leaning forward. They were listening. There was confusion on their faces, yes, and on some of them affront, but underneath it, on a great many of them, was something else, something I almost could not believe I was seeing: interest. Relief even on a few. Because, And I only understood this later. A great many of the beings in that hall did not want the war either. They had been carried toward it by the same pride and momentum that had carried me, had assembled in their splendor to pronounce a doom that some quiet part of them did not believe in. And the human, by laughing, by refusing to be doomed, by treating the whole grim ceremony as the overwrought mistake it secretly was, had given all of us permission to feel the thing we had not been permitting ourselves to feel. That this was wrong, that this was absurd, that we did not have to do this. The relief of it was already moving through the room, under the confusion, before the human had read a single word of his newspaper. He had cracked something just by laughing. The reading was about to break it open. "Here's what I mean," the human said. And he opened the newspaper again, and he began, of all things, to read us the news. "This," he said, "is an ordinary human newspaper, from an ordinary human city, printed the day I left to come here. And I want to read you some of it because I think you've forgotten, or maybe you never knew, that the species you've just declared total war on is made of people, actual people, who were doing actual ordinary things on the day you decided to destroy them." And he read. He read us small things. He read a notice about a local festival, a harvest celebration in some human town, with a recipe for a dish that would be served. He read the results of a children's sporting match, the names of the young players, a note that one of them had scored for the first time and her grandmother had cried. He read a small item about a man who had lost a pet and the neighbors who had helped him find it. He read a birth announcement, a child born to a family, the parents' joy, the weight, and the name. He read a comic strip, actually read it aloud, a small, silly human joke, and he chuckled at it and apologized and said it was a good one. He read a letter to the editor complaining about a pothole. He read the ordinary, tiny, unimportant, infinitely precious news of ordinary human life, in that vast dark hall built for doom, before the assembled might of the Galactic Empire. And I stood at my post and felt the strangest thing begin to happen in me, and I would learn in the whole room. He kept going. He read an item about an elderly couple celebrating a great many years of marriage, and the small party their neighbors had thrown them, and a quote from the old man about what he had learned in all those years, something simple and true about patience. He read a notice about a child's lost tooth and the small ritual the family had around such things. He read about a garden that had won a local prize, and the woman who had grown it, and how long she had worked at it. He read a death notice, too, and he slowed when he came to it, and read it gently, an old human who had died surrounded by family. A life summed up in a few lines, beloved, remembered, mourned. And then he read, right after it, a birth in the same column, the circle of an ordinary human life laid out plainly on the page, the dying and the being born side by side the way they always are, and he let that sit a moment and did not comment on it and did not need to. And I felt it working on me, the thing he was doing, though I did not yet have the words for it. With every small item he read, the abstraction I had carried into that hall, the humans, the enemy, the doomed species, grew thinner, and something else grew solid behind it. I had walked into that chamber knowing humanity only as a problem, a defiant minor species that needed to be brought to heel, a target. And now, item by item, that target was dissolving, and in its place were people. An old man talking about patience, a woman in her garden, a child losing a tooth, a family around a deathbed, a grandmother crying with pride, and I realized with a slow horror that built as he read, that I had been about to help destroy all of it, every garden and every old couple and every newborn child. That the word enemy I had carried so easily had been a blanket thrown over a world full of exactly these small, precious, ordinary lives, and that the human was pulling the blanket off, gently, in front of all of us, and making us look at what was underneath. I did not want to destroy a woman's garden. I did not want to kill a grandmother who cried at her granddaughter's first goal. No one, looking at the actual people, could want it. The wanting had only ever been possible because we had never looked, and the human was making us look, and I could feel my certainty dying as he read, item by ordinary item, the obituary of my ability to see his people as anything but people. Because we could not hold it. That is what I have to make you understand. The declaration of war works. It had always worked by abstraction. By making the doomed people into a thing, an enemy, an offense against the imperial order, a target. The whole terrible ceremony was engineered to keep the doomed people abstract, to never let them be anything but the doomed, so that the destruction could proceed cleanly, without anyone in that hall having to think about what was actually being destroyed. And the human, with his newspaper, was doing the one thing that abstraction cannot survive. He was making humanity particular. He was filling that hall, which had been engineered to hold only doom, with grandmothers crying at sporting matches, and children being born and lost pets found, and bad jokes in comic strips and potholes and harvest festivals, with the small, ordinary, specific texture of actual lives, actual people, the people we had just declared war on, and you cannot, it turns out, hold the abstraction and the particular in your mind at the same time. The moment humanity stopped being the enemy and became a grandmother crying with pride, the whole machinery of the declaration began to come apart, because you cannot declare total war on a grandmother crying with pride. You can declare it on an enemy. You cannot declare it on a person. And the human was turning the enemy, item by item, small human item by small human item, back into people in front of the entire empire, and the entire empire had no defense against it at all. I watched it happen on the faces around me, the same collapse that was happening in me. There was an old dignitary near my post, a being I knew by reputation as one of the hardest in the imperial court, a veteran of 100 conquests who had pronounced or endorsed more dooms than almost anyone living. And I watched that hard old being listen to the human read about the elderly couple's anniversary, and I watched something move across his ancient face, some flicker of recognition, perhaps of his own long life, his own marriage. Whatever an old conqueror carries privately beneath the hardness, and I watched him look away, briefly, the way you look away from a thing that has touched you when you do not wish to be seen being touched. And he was not the only one. All across that hall of terrible dignitaries, the small, ordinary human news was finding the small, ordinary places in each of them that the imperial hardness had never quite reached. The part that had a grandmother, or a garden, or a child, or a marriage, or had once lost someone and grieved. And each item the human reed reached through the splendor and the menace to those small, soft, human-shaped places and woke them, one by one, until the hall that had assembled to pronounce a doom was full of beings quietly remembering that they, too, were made of exactly the kind of small, precious, ordinary life the human was reading aloud, and that the people on the other end of the doom were no different. You could feel the abstraction dying in the room. You could feel enemy losing its meaning, dissolving, becoming impossible to hold, as a hall full of conquerors was reminded by a man with a newspaper of the one thing conquest requires you to forget, that the other is a person, exactly and fully a person, as real as you, with a garden and a grandmother and a newborn child of their own. And about the misunderstanding, the human went on, setting the newspaper down at last. And here his voice changed, became gentler, and he told us the thing that I think most of the imperial court did not actually know, the thing that turned the whole declaration from a tragedy into a farce. He explained, simply and clearly, what the war was actually about, the offense humanity was supposed to have committed against the imperial order, the provocation that had justified the declaration. And it was nothing. I will not detail the particulars because they are almost too embarrassing to record, but the substance of it was that the entire war rested on a misunderstanding, a thing humanity had done that the imperial court had interpreted as a deliberate insult to imperial power, and that had been, in fact, nothing of the kind, just an ordinary human action, innocent, easily explained. That the machinery of imperial pride had inflated into a casus belli, because the machinery of imperial pride was always looking for offenses to inflate. The humans had not insulted the Empire. They had simply not behaved the way a properly frightened lesser species was supposed to behave, and the imperial court, unable to tolerate that, had constructed a grievance out of it, and built a war on the grievance, and summoned humanity here to be destroyed for a crime it had not committed, and did not even know it was supposed to have committed. The human laid it all out, plainly, gently, the way you explain a simple mistake to someone you do not wish to embarrass more than necessary. And the hall listened in a silence that had changed its quality entirely, because the dignitaries were beginning, one by one, to understand that the envoy was right, that they had all assembled in their terrible splendor to pronounce doom over a misunderstanding, and that the small, unremarkable human with the newspaper was the only one in the room who had bothered to check. "So here's what I'd like to propose," the human said, and he smiled, that warm, ordinary human smile, into the face of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. "I don't think you actually want to do this. I think you got yourselves into a position, the way large, proud institutions do, where declaring war felt like the only way to save face, and now you're committed to a course that's going to kill an enormous number of people, yours and ours both. Because I'll be honest, we'd fight, and we're harder to kill than you think, and it would be a catastrophe for everyone, over a thing that didn't actually happen. And I don't think anyone in this room actually wants that, now that you've heard a little of who we are and a little of what this is really about. So I'm not going to surrender, because there's nothing to surrender over, and I'm not going to threaten you, because I didn't come here to start a war either. I'm just going to suggest, gently, that we all admit this was a misunderstanding, and that nobody in that newspaper needs to die, and that you let me go home and tell my people that the Galactic Empire is wise enough to stop a war it started by accident. You'd look strong doing that. Stopping a war takes more strength than starting one. Anyone can start one." And he picked the newspaper back up and folded it and tucked it away, and stood there, calm and pleasant and unafraid, having offered the Empire not a defeat but a door. That's where I have to stop this time. Because what the Empire did then, whether 10,000 years of imperial pride could bend, could accept the door the human held open, could choose to look strong by stopping rather than strong by destroying. And what it did to all of us in that hall, and to me most of all, to watch a single unarmed man with a newspaper offer the most powerful empire in the galaxy a way to be better than itself. That's the resolution, the whole of it, and I need you standing exactly here first. In the great hall of declarations, the doom of humanity dissolved into grandmothers and comic strips and a gently explained misunderstanding. The assembled empire stripped of its abstraction and made, against its will, to see the people it had meant to destroy, and one calm human, having refused both to kneel and to threaten, holding open a door that 10,000 years of imperial pride had never once walked through. The door marked stop. The silence after the human finished was the longest of my life. I have been in battles since, in moments where my life hung on the next second, and none of them stretched the way that silence stretched, because in that silence the entire future of two peoples, and the soul of the Galactic Empire itself, hung in the balance, waiting to see which way 10,000 years of pride would fall. The High Declarant stood at his post, and I watched his face, and I could see the war happening inside him. The war that was, I understand now, the only war that actually mattered that day, the war between the Empire's pride and the Empire's chance to be better than its pride. Because the human was right, and everyone in that hall now knew the human was right, and the only question left was whether the Empire could bear to admit it. To take the door the human held open, to say, in effect, yes, this was a misunderstanding, and we will stop, meant admitting that the Empire had been wrong, that the grandest war machine in the galaxy had assembled in all its terrible majesty to destroy a people over nothing, that the magnificent declaration had been a mistake. 10,000 years of imperial pride screamed against that admission. Everything I had been raised to believe screamed against it. An empire does not admit error. An empire does not stop. An empire that has declared war does not undeclare it, because to do so is to show weakness, and weakness, we had always believed, was the one thing an empire could not survive. And in that screaming silence, I felt the first true crack in my own faith, because I found myself, to my own horror then, to my own pride, now hoping the empire would take the door, hoping that the thing I had been raised to see as weakness might turn out to be the only strength that mattered. I did not want the war. Standing there, having heard the newspaper, having heard about the grandmother and the newborn child and the lost pet found, I did not want to destroy these people, and I realized, with a vertigo that nearly buckled my knees, that I never had, that none of us had, that we had been about to do a thing that no one in the room actually wanted to do, carried toward it by pride and momentum and the terrible inertia of a machine built to destroy. And that the human with his newspaper had just given us the first chance any of us had ever had to step off the path and choose otherwise. I hoped. An officer of the empire, sworn to its glory, stood at his post and hoped with his whole heart that the empire would have the courage to back down. And I was not alone. That was the thing I could feel in the held silence, the thing that made it bearable, that the whole hall was hoping with me. I could feel it, the collective held breath of thousands of beings who had all, in the space of one newspaper, arrived at the same place I had, who had all been made to see the people behind the doom, and who all now did not want to proceed, and were all waiting with the same desperate, quiet hope to see whether the empire would let them not proceed. It is a strange thing to feel 1,000 proud conquerors silently praying for mercy. But that is what was in that hall, in the long silence after the human folded his newspaper. 1,000 beings who had walked in certain of the doom, and now every one of them hoped it would not fall, and none of whom could say so, because the saying of it had to come from the high declarant, from the keeper of the ceremony, from the one voice that could turn the whole machine. We all looked at him. The weight of the moment had gathered onto one old being, and we watched him bear it. And I saw the struggle in him, naked on his ancient face, the war between everything he had been and the thing he now knew to be true. He had given his whole long life to the ceremony of doom. He had pronounced more dooms than anyone alive. To undeclare this war was to call into question not just this declaration, but all of them, every doom he had ever spoken, the whole meaning of his life. And I watched him understand that, watched the terrible cost of it move through him. And I thought, in that moment, that he would not be able to do it, that the weight of his own history would hold him to the script, that pride would win because pride almost always wins. And I grieved already for the war I thought was coming, and for the grandmother in the newspaper, and for all of us who did not want this and were about to do it anyway because one old being could not bear to unsay his life's work. It did. I will tell you that now, because the suspense is not the point and the mercy of the outcome is. The high declarant, an old being, who had pronounced more dooms than anyone alive, who had given his whole life to the terrible ceremony. The high declarant looked at the human for a long moment, and then he looked at the newspaper in the human's hand, and then he did a thing that I do not think had happened in the Hall of Declarations in 10,000 years. He set down the staff of his office. And he said in his own voice, not the great ceremonial voice, but the voice of a tired old being who had just been shown something true, "You are correct. This has been a misunderstanding. The empire does not make war on grandmothers." And he declared the declaration void, just like that, with a sentence. The most powerful empire in the galaxy undeclared its war, in the great dark hall built to make such a thing unthinkable, because a single unarmed human had laughed and opened a newspaper and reminded 10,000 years of imperial majesty that the people on the other end of its doom were people. There was no surrender. There was no battle. There was no human fleet, no terrible weapon, no display of power that cowed the empire into backing down. There was only a man with a newspaper, and the truth, and a door, and an empire that found, when it mattered, just barely enough humility to walk through it. What happened in the hall in the moments after is something I will never forget, because it was the opposite of everything that chamber had ever held. There was a silence first, a stunned, disbelieving silence, as thousands of beings registered that the unthinkable had just happened, that an imperial declaration had been voided, that there would be no war. And then, from somewhere in the ranked dignitaries, there came a sound that had surely never been heard in the Hall of Declarations in all its 10,000 years. Relief. An audible, collective exhalation, the sound of 1,000 beings who had been holding a breath they did not know they were holding, releasing it all at once. No one cheered, we were too imperial for that, and the moment was too strange. But the relief moved through that hall like a warm wind through a cold place, and I felt it in myself, a loosening, a lightness, the almost physical sensation of a terrible weight lifting that I had not even known I was carrying until it was gone. We were not going to destroy them. We were not going to do the thing. The grandmother in the newspaper would cry at more of her granddaughter's goals, and the garden would grow, and the newborn child would live, and none of it would be ash, because an old being had set down his staff, and a younger one had laughed and opened a newspaper, and between them they had saved a world and spared us from becoming the thing we had walked in ready to be. The human bowed. That was the last thing he did before he left. He turned to the high declarant, and he bowed, a real bow, respectful with no mockery in it at all, the bow of one person honoring another for a hard thing well done. He understood, I think, what it had cost the old being to unsay his life's work, and he honored it. And then he gathered his newspaper and tucked it away in his plain dark coat, and he walked back across the vast floor of the Hall of Declarations toward the great doors. And as he passed the ranked officers, he caught my eye again, the way he had when he entered, and he gave me another small friendly nod, one person to another, and this time I understood it, and this time, to my own astonishment, I returned it. An officer of the Empire, nodding to the envoy of the people he had been ready to destroy, in mutual acknowledgement that they were both, after all, just people, and that something good and rare had just happened in that terrible room. And then he was gone, out through the great doors, an unremarkable man in a plain dark suit who had walked into the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy with a folded newspaper and walked out having stopped a war. And the hall he left behind was never the same, and neither was the empire, and neither was I. The galaxy, when it heard, did tremble, and I want to be precise about the trembling, because the histories get it wrong, the way they always get these things wrong. They say the galaxy trembled because humanity had faced down the empire and won, and they tell it as a story of human power, of the species so formidable that even the Galactic Empire backed away. That is not what made the galaxy tremble. What made the galaxy tremble was something far more unsettling to a galaxy built on imperial power, the discovery that the empire could be stopped without being fought. For 10,000 years, every people in the galaxy had believed that the Empire's declarations were absolute, that the only responses were submission or destruction, that there was no power in the universe that could halt the imperial machine once it began to move. And a single human with a folded newspaper had halted it, not with a greater force, but with a smaller truth, with the simple human insistence that the people about to be destroyed were people, and that a war built on a misunderstanding did not have to happen. The galaxy trembled because the human had revealed that the Empire's terrible power had always had a crack in it, a place where it could be reached, not by force, which only fed it, but by truth, by humanity, by the refusal to let an abstraction stand where a person stood. Every subjugated people in the galaxy, every people that had ever knelt before an imperial declaration believing it had no choice, suddenly understood that there had been another way all along, that the unstoppable had always been stoppable, that you did not have to either kneel or burn. You could, if you were brave enough and human enough, simply open a newspaper and remind the machine that you were real. That is what made the galaxy tremble, not human strength. The end of the Empire's myth, of its own inevitability. I learned more about the Envoy in later years, and what I learned only deepened what I had witnessed. He was not, it turned out, some great human statesman, some renowned master of diplomacy specially chosen for his brilliance. He was an ordinary man. That was rather the point of him, I came to think, that humanity had sent an ordinary man, that the laugh and the newspaper had not been a clever stratagem devised by some genius, but simply the natural response of a decent, ordinary person to an absurd and terrible situation. He had volunteered, I was told. When the Empire's declaration came, and humanity needed to send an envoy into the heart of the imperial capital to receive the doom, knowing the envoy might well not return, this ordinary man had put himself forward, and when asked why, and what his plan was, he had reportedly said something simple, that he did not have a plan exactly, but that he did not believe the Empire really wanted to murder a world full of people, that no one really did. That they had just lost sight of who they were dealing with, and that maybe if someone reminded them, gently, that the humans were people, the whole thing might not have to happen. And so he had folded up his hometown newspaper and put it in his coat and flown to the imperial capital to remind the most powerful empire in the galaxy that the enemy had grandmothers. That was the whole of his strategy. It should not have worked. By every law of power it should not have worked. And it worked because it was true, and because underneath all our imperial hardness we were people too, and a person reminded of the personhood of another cannot, in the end, easily destroy them. And the change he started spread slowly, far beyond that hall. I will give you one instance because I saw it myself years later. There was another people, another small defiant species the Empire had grown irritated with, and the old machinery began to turn toward them, the way it always had, the talk of provocations and offenses, the gathering momentum toward a declaration. But this time something was different. This time in the imperial councils, a voice was raised, and then several voices asking the question that no one would have thought to ask before the human and his newspaper. Have we actually understood these people? Have we read their newspaper? Are we sure this is a war and not a misunderstanding? And someone was sent, not to declare doom, but to find out, to go and actually learn who these people were, to see them as people before deciding they were enemies. And there was no war. The thing was resolved, the misunderstanding cleared, the two peoples reaching an arrangement that a generation earlier would have been unthinkable, because the imperial machine had learned to do the thing the human taught it in the Hall of Declarations, to look behind the abstraction for the person, to read the newspaper before pronouncing the doom. I sat in on some of that in my later career, and every time I did I thought of the ordinary man with his folded paper, and I understood that he had not just stopped one war. He had taught an empire to hesitate, and an empire that hesitates is an empire that has begun, at last, to become something better than an empire. And the empire was never the same, and neither was I. The undeclaration in the Hall of Declarations was the beginning of a change that worked through the whole imperial body over the years that followed slowly, the way such changes work. Because once it had been shown that an imperial declaration could be stopped, could be wrong, could be a misunderstanding, the terrible certainty that had powered the empire for 10,000 years began to fail. We could no longer pronounce doom with the old clean confidence, because we had all seen in that hall a doom dissolve into grandmothers and comic strips, and we could not unsee it. The machine of imperial war, which had run on abstraction, on never seeing the doomed as people, found that it could no longer keep them abstract, because a human had taught the whole empire to see the newspaper behind the enemy, the ordinary precious particular life behind every target. It made us worse at war. It made us, slowly, better at being a civilization. The empire that had declared war on humanity became, over the long years after, something it had never been in 10,000 years of conquest. A power that hesitated, that checked, that asked, before it pronounced a people's doom, whether there might be a newspaper it had not read, a misunderstanding it had not examined, a grandmother it was about to destroy. We conquered less. We listened more. We became, by slow degrees, less of an empire and more of a neighbor, and the galaxy that had trembled at our declarations began, instead, to actually deal with us, as peoples deal with peoples, and it was a smaller role and an infinitely better one. As for me, I left the Imperial service in the end, though not right away. I could not, after that day, go on pronouncing dooms or preparing for them or believing in them. The human with his newspaper had ruined me for the work I was raised to do in the best possible way. I spent the rest of my career, and then the rest of my life, working for the thing the human had shown me in that hall. The thing I did not have a name for then and would call, now, simply peace, though it is a bigger and harder word than people think. I tried to be in the Empire and then in the wider galaxy, the one who opened the newspaper, the one who insisted on the particular when everyone else was reaching for the abstraction, the one who reminded the machine, whenever the machine began to move toward someone's doom, that there was a grandmother on the other end of it, a child, a lost pet found, a life. It is unglamorous work. It does not make the histories. But it is the work that the human did in that hall, the work of keeping people, and it is, I have come to believe, the only work that has ever actually mattered. People tell this story as a tale of human audacity. The Galactic Empire declared war, and humanity's envoy just laughed and opened a newspaper. And they imagine, I think, a moment of magnificent human defiance, the brave envoy who was too powerful, too superior, to fear the Empire's threat. And every time I correct them because I was there, and the truth is gentler and far greater than the defiance they imagine. The human did not laugh because he was superior. He did not laugh because humanity was so mighty that the Empire's war was beneath his notice. He laughed because the whole thing was a tragedy pretending to be a triumph, a catastrophe built out of pride and abstraction, and a misunderstanding no one had bothered to check. And the laugh was not contempt. It was almost grief. The grief of a man watching enormous machinery assemble to destroy something precious over nothing, and choosing, instead of fear or fury, to puncture the whole absurd, terrible thing with the smallest, most human possible object. A folded newspaper full of ordinary life held up against the doom. He did not defeat the Empire. He did something much harder and much better. He reminded the Empire that the enemy was made of grandmothers, and gave it the chance to be the kind of power that does not destroy grandmothers, and the Empire barely took the chance, and the galaxy was never the same. The Galactic Empire declared war on humanity, and humanity's envoy laughed, and opened a newspaper, and read us the news, the births and the festivals and the lost pets and the bad jokes, the small, ordinary, precious texture of the lives we had come to destroy. And in doing so, he disarmed the most terrible war machine in the galaxy with the one weapon it had no defense against, which was not power and was not fear, but was simply the truth that the enemy was people, that the enemy had always been people, that there is no such thing as an enemy at all, only people we have not yet bothered to see the newspaper of. The galaxy trembled that day, and it thought it was trembling at human strength. It was wrong. It was trembling at the discovery that the unstoppable could be stopped, not by a greater force, but by a smaller kindness, by a man who refused to be afraid, and refused to be cruel, and simply, gently, in the face of all that terrible majesty, opened a newspaper and read aloud the names of the people we were about to forget were real.